Hey, welcome back to another video lesson for Queer Astrology Club. Today we're going to be looking at Saturn through the signs and houses. I might make this into a PDF so you don't, you can read it at your own leisure because it is kind of detailed, but you can also just pause the video and take notes for keywords. And the keywords will start to emerge as we move through them, the descriptions of Saturn, that is. And you'll start to see some patterns developing, and then you can start applying them to your own life. I'm gonna close this window. I always do that. So let's go ahead and share the screen and begin. Yeah, so Saturn and the signs and houses, I cleverly gave it a subtitle, Don't Worry, It's Worse Than You Thought. Yeah, I'm Palace Garza, like I said. You can go to astrovedicus.wordpress.com. Again, that's Astrovedicus. It's a weird word, I guess I made up. Yeah, that's my blog. You can find all my writings there, and you can find the PDFs for these videos, if I ever make them. It's also the place you can find my donate link if you want to throw me coins for all of this free labor that I'm doing for you queers. So first let's, where's my, well, first the names of Saturn. Saturnus. I mean, Saturn isn't just Saturn. That's a very Western and limited viewpoint to just, you have to use all the names of the planets to really understand them and to kind of get you out of this Greek, Hellenistic, Greco-Roman, patriarchal bullshit. There are feminine names of Saturn. I mean, I think Saturn's even agender, really. That's kind of like the Indian viewpoint. Agender, but leaning towards the feminine. So learning the different names, it's certainly valuable for magical applications and for just generally understanding what the fuck you're talking about. But Saturn is one part of it, who was the harvest god, who was like the wealth and ruler of storehouses and agriculture and farming, and sort of like the more hands-on labor that requires a lot of endurance, right? That's the theme of Saturn's work. You know, there's other names where we get the name Sabbath day, Shabbatai, Shabbat, I don't know. There's also Kronos, which is like the Roman version, so kind of like the Titan of time, and like this sort of impeding, sort of oppressive figure who tries to limit the growth of the new and kind of represents old customs and old ways. You also have the name Ninurta, the Babylonian farming deity. It was also associated with the Akkadian Shamash, who was like the old sun, because it was, you know, the other name associated with Saturn was like Kaimanu, or like, which means stationary. And so to that point, Saturn was like a second sun within our solar system, and it kind of has its own authority, or was seen as the golden age of a different realm of rulership, authority, and leadership. So there's this feeling of ancestry or lineage that's very heavy within Saturn. So Samash is proof that Saturn is a sun in terms of his own right, he's a polar star, which I like. His polar kind of invokes an image of iciness, which certainly Saturn is very cold in action and function throughout the chart. But yeah, he's she. I'm going to switch gender for Saturn. That's just, I'm going to say she, he, they, and it's all correct, because none of them are correct. Saturn is this sort of, I don't know, you'll see. There's one of the other names is Shanicharya, or just Shani, which means slow-moving one, or the slow-moving chariot, slow-moving, the one that drags, because he moves so slowly in the sky. They move so slowly in the sky, and as a result, the transits are really intense and harsh, and they sort of lend more towards generational leanings and like groups of people. but it's personal enough. It's not as slow as Neptune and the others, but um, Saturn's Saturn's effects are nevertheless unmistakable. One of the cool images that I kind of link to Saturn is Nana Buruku, which is from the Fawn people, so like the lineages of voodoo magic within different island regions. So Nana Buruku was kind of like I think kind of like a form of Imaya in a weird way, like, but a lot of people say or speculate that she's pictured here in this purple dress, but she's kind of like the dark feminine goddess of the swamp. And there's this cool story of her protecting the swamp when the Mars-like figure in their mythology was Chango. Shango, he tries to cut through her swamp with a blade, and she's notorious for being anti-metal, anti-industry, anti-patriarchy, anti-violence, because she works with the rhythms of nature and like kind of like the dark crocodile forces of nature. Well, yeah, she turned the earth because of her earth-like attributes and her wisdom. He tried to he tried to go to this. He was on a task, Chango, the Mars god, and he didn't want to take a detour, so he tried to cut through her swamp, and she turned the earth below him. You know, she warned him first, right? Saturn always gives us tons of warnings she moves slowly, and she gives us the opportunity to change. And it's if we don't abide by these sort of warnings, that things can become hard, especially when we're trying to reconcile Saturnian and martial things in our life, which are the two primary malefics. So that being said, she basically turned the whole swamp, made the swamp enlarge and engulfed him. And he tried to use this machete to cut through the mud, but couldn't. He could never get a hold on the land. And it wasn't until he gave up and had exhausted himself by trying to fight this immovable force of earth that he retreated and reconciled himself to go the long way. Nevertheless, he left the swamp cursing her name and like, you old woman, you crazy old woman, you old hag. So there's always this sort of enmity between the Saturnian wisdom of the old hag, the old crone, old Kronos, right? Do we see these connections? The old ways will always sort of outlast the young, impulsive, martial drive. So that being said, one of the prayers for Shani and Jyotish, which is supposed to be a good remediation for Saturn, which you can chant like 108 times, 108 being a mystical number. It's like the complete divine form of 100. The mantra is up there. It's Om Bram Brim Bram Solushanya Namaha. 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 So these are just some sort of basic attributes in a mythological perspective, and it kind of gives us, if you're wondering where do we get these characteristics of Saturn, they're not out of nowhere. They kind of come from a mythological, like a tumbleweed through time. These deities accumulate syncretizations as they move cross-culturally. And certainly that cross-cultural traveling of deities, there's a certain violence in it, but nevertheless, it's our ancestral heritage, So, yeah, Saturn in the old days, in the ancient realm, for the ancients, was like the lord of the boundary of the visible time-space, because they couldn't see planets past it. So, as such, as being kind of like a bounds keeper or a gatekeeper to the unknown, or to the veil keeper, Saturn speaks to our resistance, fear, motivations, or true internal motivations, our endurance, our chronicity, our limitations, our reduced or minimalized experience, so the sum total of our experiences, and the harvest of our potential and our life force, which of course is death. which is kind of forms the structure of our next life, our next rebirth, if you kind of believe in that realm. But if you don't believe in that sort of karmic rebirth, Saturn also will fit into your concept of sort of weighing the actions of your life to determine the effects of your afterlife and what will become of you. That's certainly Shani. Shani has that role. And certainly in the scales of justice, it's said that, which is Libra constellation, the scales are made of lead, which is Saturn's metal, as we'll see later. So Saturn in a lot of ways is kind of like the force of the judgment card in tarot, the ultimate, the omega that is the alpha. Next. So here's some considerations when you're trying to read the effects of Saturn in a chart. You have to consider the ruler, the sign Saturn is in. You have to consider the ruler of that sign. And then that's in the natal chart. And that's super important because that's going to heavily flavor Saturn, just like you'll behave differently when you're in different people's houses. Like if you were in your own house versus you were in the White House or in the Prime Minister's house or the Parliament building, whatever the fuck. And that's natally, but in transit, Saturn will often behave as if in opposition. I find that to be true, and medically, but psychologically, it can be hard to place Saturn's effect within that sign because the opposition is such a strong force for Saturn because of the gravity and the pulling that happens to the opposite sign. It's like a tractor beam, if you can imagine that or conceptualize that, and a gravitational force. It's very, very, very heavy and cold. Also, in the natal chart, the inferior backward sextile is a frigid beast. So it's also really intense, sextiles are generally considered benefic aspects or good aspects for Saturn. It can be very difficult for a planet that's in that way receiving an exact sextile, or a left-handed or an inferior or a backward sextile that planet will have severe dysfunction. The house position of the planet will affect its prominence and ease of function. So that's called our directional strength in Jyotish, and we're going to get into that a little bit later with the visuals. I will not just... So, like I said, Saturn, to really read, I can go on and on about the concept of these mythological deities, but you need to know how that's going to affect you. So you're going to, like I said, you're going to look at the sign, the house, and then of course you have to look at mitigating aspects, which is the testimony or the aspects from other planets, right? Just like, okay, so you're in a sign, you're in your own house, but then who can see you through the windows? If you have 4 neighbors looking in on you in the middle of the night, or just even during the day, are you gonna kill someone? Are you gonna masturbate? Are you gonna take your clothes off? Are you gonna, you're gonna behave differently? And depending on which neighbor, maybe you will take your clothes off for certain neighbors. My point being, all of these make the delineation, which is the now basically just means a precise description or portrayal. So to become more precise, we have to look at these other factors. That's the whole point of astrology, is you have to move in layers. You can't it's hard to just jump in. You have to, go into the pool step by step so you really get a feel for it. So Saturn so here's an example. Like in this chart, or in this really simplified natal chart, right? We have Saturn in Libra, and then so Saturn's right here, and we have Venus in Aries. Cool, we're just looking at 2 planets. So we see that Saturn's lord, because Libra is ruled by Venus, Saturn is in the house of Venus. In the sign of Venus, and will behave, and will have a very Venusian flavor, which is kind of leans towards a sort of socially diplomatic version of Saturn that imposes social orders. But we have to look to her to kind of see how, or we have to look to Venus to see how Saturn's strength is going to kind of, how it will behave. Because if the Lord of Venus or the Lord of Libra is kind of weak or not doing well, that's going to affect the resources that are available to Saturn. Does that make sense? Just like if you're in a house, like say you're in Venus's house, but she just moved out and there's no, and the water's shut off and the electricity's turned off, as opposed to being in Venus's house, you know, when she just got a promotion and like there's, you know, it's like a luxury paradise. So you have to, if we look where she is, she's over in Aries, which is considered the, you know, the ruled by this martial Mars, violent, aggressive thing. So now you have to see, well, Venus isn't going to be like a Venus for Saturn. It's going to be this sort of, it's going to give it a more hot-blooded quality. And then you look at the aspect between the two. You see that Venus is opposing Saturn in the chart. So Venus is staring in opposition. We know that Saturn gives a cold opposition. So we can see that they're not in agreement in the chart. So we can see that, or we can delineate that, you know, the weak testimony will corrupt Saturn's controlled diplomacy and that social ordering. It can make Saturn aggressive or susceptible to seduction, underhanded methods of social exploitation through kind of unscrupulous ways or means or pursuit. You know, it's like the war over sensory pleasure and how that relates to resources. So it can be a not so good thing, despite Saturn being exalted. And you can apply that in your own chart. Just look to the ruler of Saturn and then go from there. I have to keep moving my face around. I don't know what, this is getting annoying or really annoying. Can I make this smaller? Can I just take it out? Also, there's directional strength too. You look at the house that each, you know, planet is in, you can determine how they're going to function. In this case, Saturn does really well in the 7th because it opposes the 1st, which is considered the self, horoscopos, the helm of the chart, the front of the ship. So if Saturn can direct the boat or direct where the front of the ship is going, usually that will be, the steersman will be in the back of the ship. So, you know, Saturn, she also does well in the 10th, and that's called throne yoga in Jyotish. So, you know, a Saturn above the horizon is going to function a little bit better because Saturn below and the more personal planets, it's going to have a different effect, a kind of more, a more intensification, internalizing effect. But you can see Jupiter and Mercury do well in the 1st to work on the body, and to work on the self directly. That's really great if you have that. 4th, the hidden below realms, Venus and Moon do well there. They are more comfortable at home. And like I told you, 7th Saturn, and of course career, Sun and Mars, those planets do well in the very public, high above the horizon. So there's natural relationships in Jyotish, or there's, you know, the planets all kind of have their own personalities, and as such they function in different ways. This is pretty much unlike Hellenistic or modern astrology, and I think it's sort of a missing psychological layer. This is the foundation for the Avastas in Jyotish, which is a system of kind of describing how the planets are going to work in a sign. It's not like planetary condition or dignity. You know, planetary dignity in Hellenistic astrology, which is like how well a planet functions in the sign that it's in. Well, there's natural relationships to the planets. Like, for example, Saturn's friends are Mercury and Venus down below. So when Saturn is in the signs of Mercury, Gemini, Virgo, or of Venus, Taurus, Libra, you know that Saturn's in the sign of a friend, which is why Saturn does well in Libra. So neutrals are kind of planets that, you know, it's neither here nor there. It's like a colleague at work. You don't really care one way or the other, but it functions when it functions. but there's no extreme. Saturn is actually that way with Jupiter, which is interesting. Um, Jupiter returns that neutrality, in fact, because they kind of have similar goals in developing consciousness. They just go about it in different ways. So I think there's like a mutual neutral respect. Saturn's enemies, however, are the sun, which makes a lot of sense because Saturn is the old polar star, which kind of was the government that was overthrown by the sun, the solar patriarchy, because Saturn is that feminine of the Titan past, the Titan deities that were slain by the Apollos and the Zeuses and the Mitras um, and the Indras of the world. So, or the Marduks rather. So, which is like major Babylonian deity. But yeah, Saturn also doesn't get along with the moon or Mars. So neither luminary, and then Saturn just finds Mars to be too destructive for the order necessary for Mars. But Mars functions well in Saturn's houses, or Saturn's signs rather. When Saturn's in the sign of an enemy in Leo and Cancer and Scorpio or in Aries, in fact, Aries is Saturn's fall, the opposite of exaltation. Saturn is considered to have a more worse off avasta, or a more worse off dignity. So that's you can't just do that though. You have to look at where the aspectual relationship between the planets. Like for example, if Saturn was neutral to Jupiter, right? So Saturn's, let's say, in Pisces, because Jupiter rules Pisces. Well, Saturn would be in a neutral relationship with Jupiter. But you look at the aspect, if Jupiter was opposite Saturn, that aspect is harsh or oppositional or unfriendly. And so that can tip the neutral relationship over into enmity. And you'd call them like just first-rate enemies. But let's say that Saturn was in the sign of an enemy, say Leo, and then was in an oppositional relationship with the sun, the owner of Leo. Well, then not only is Saturn in the sign of an enemy, Saturn is being opposed by that enemy. And so you have like double the enmity. It's considered even worse. And that ranks the score of Saturn a lot worse. The dignity gets harmed, and Saturn's functioning won't be as good. And you'll look at the Avasta, some of them. Well, actually, that's beyond the scope of this. But here's Jyotish says, check your Avastas, you dumb Westerner, because there's so many rich, there's so much rich assistance to help you with delineation and determining planetary function. So you can see in odd Rashis, this one, okay, well, there's different levels of Avastas. Let me just back up here. There's Baladi, Jagrat, and Lajitari Avastas. So if you want to study Jyotish, you're going to eventually have to learn those because they're in the Brihat Parashara Shastra, which is a pretty fundamental and elementary text. So yeah, these are the elementary lessons. In odd Rashi, you have 0 through 6 degrees is like the child strength or the child's mindset. So if a planet is in an odd Rashi, let's say Aries, and is in 5 degrees, it will have the strength of a child, which is good for, say, Mercury. Mercury functions as well as a child and is known as Mercurius vivens, the eternal child. So that's great for curiosity and like learning and development, and it will show at what stage of life that the planet will be more active. Does that make sense? So this is a really powerful one to start with, Baladi, and it's really easy once you just have this chart. Saturn does really well as Vrid, which is in these later degrees in an odd or more towards the middle and even. So you just try to figure out, is the planet going to be a child, an adolescent, a youth, old, or dead? And dead is usually really, really bad for functioning of the planet. So this is just one of us. You have 3 other groups, I think. No, just 2. And you kind of put them all together. One of them is about whether the planets are sleeping or awake. you want a planet that's in a good, in its own sign or exalted will be considered awake. That means it, it's at the office, it's had its coffee, it can do its job. Then you have kind of sleepy, which is kind of like you haven't had your coffee, but you're at your work, so you're less productive and you miss a lot of details and errors, you make a lot of issues. And then completely asleep is when a planet is in like the sign of an enemy, like say Saturn in Pisces. That would be completely asleep. Or sorry, Saturn in Scorpio. That would be a completely unconscious Saturn that is just kind of, all the past karmas will move the person without any sort of spiritual, they're asleep at the wheel. That's the only way I can describe it. And then they're going to call all of that unresolved psychological parts of themselves, they're going to label that as fate, or it just couldn't be helped. It could. You're just working against planetary forces that aren't to your benefit or that aren't conducive to growth in that area. So you kind of want to focus on the strengths of the chart. And hopefully your Saturn is strong, because that is a great way to develop spiritually. I'm not saying you're going to be spared any like difficulties of Saturn. But let's just go ahead and start Saturn through the signs, because we kind of have to get this. And I'm going to go kind of fast because there's a lot to cover, because we also have to do the houses in this presentation. So I'm going to go kind of over keywords. But first, you just kind of have to know the cardinal mode. You have these 4 modes. I'm sorry, you have 3 modes, but 4 signs each. And 4 times 3 is 12. So the cardinal mode is the form of energy expressed at the equinoxes and the solstices. So they're like initiatory, and they refer to the principle of change and momentum. It represents the active and intense life experiences that generates power. So it's dynamic, it's initiatory, it's that passionate energy that promotes action and provides strong and clear direction. But its weakness is in haste, and its strength is in motivation. So it's kind of a slow-moving, methodical, highly motivated place for your Saturn to be. It slows down impulses. And honestly, like motivational tactics for these Saturnian people to them, what is viewed as uniting is actually alienating. And Saturn has to be really sure about using lawful and methodical structures or methodical methods. They need to include people in the process of creating something, because otherwise people are unmotivated. And Daniel Ariely in his works, who's an Israeli behavioralist or whatever, is he a psychologist? He basically says like the factory environment that Saturn loves is efficient because everybody has one goal, one role, but they don't see the whole of the work. So they're never going to be as passionate as you, being a Saturn in a cardinal mode. You like to have, that which you initiate should be inclusive of everybody, should be democratic in a lot of ways. Saturn very rarely functions successfully as a dictator. It's just not wired for that. It moves too slowly. It doesn't have the energy to maintain that. So Saturn might try to impose dictatorial systems, but ultimately a higher functioning Saturn will try to keep the work in context for everyone, which is good for morale and mutual understanding. It avoids disjointed out ideals and becoming too idealistic. So Saturn and cardinals are great. It's the initial wind in your sails, right? But the wind in your sails can change without systems of accountability, right? That's super important for developing for the Saturn in Capricorn, Saturn in Libra, Saturn in Aries, Saturn in Cancer. Is that accountability factor that will keep the winds blowing in the same direction, that motivation. So Libra and Saturn a Libra Saturn, like we already talked about in the first example, ruled by Venus, is called Uttama, or exalted. And it's kind of the Libra that is struggling for that social diplomacy and justice. There's that fear, there's like a terrible fear of disorder and an imposition of lawful order. So in some ways, like I said, the cardinal signs can be bullies and an elitist in some way. In their life, these people have delayed social material success. They're good at politics. They redistribute wealth effectively. They tend to be more even though it's a Venus sign, they tend to be more conservative, if not downright tawdry as dressers or in materials. Stuff, aesthetics aren't as important to them. They're easily thwarted by imbalance, though. And they do a lot of intellectual aerobics. They're attracted to high status jobs, but they are attached to low status people. Not attached, but they don't, I don't know, they just sort of, despite being social elitists, they understand they're not above, lower ideologies. But this kind of placement shields from superficial agreements and being taken advantage of in contracts. Saturn's usually hyper vigilant of hyper restless of being taken advantage of in Saturn and Libra rather. Like the Iran-Contra hostage situation, which was the President Carter in the United States. It was just this hostage situation where the terms of the negotiations were too lofty and idealistic, and they needed to just get those hostages out of there and save their lives at no matter the cost. So a lot of people were very critical of his, Libran Saturn, which was way too focused on like getting the best deal. Sometimes you just have to, your ideals are going to get in your own way. So for Aries Saturn, which is the opposite, Nietzsche, the debilitated Saturn, the Saturn that is going to be functioning in a much more rash, a fear-based rashness, is going to be disobedient, unyielding, unheeding. So the advice will be lost on a Saturn in Aries. There'll be ask holes if they ask you for help at all. Fear of aggressive competitors, the resistance to innovation. They tend to be bloodline fanatics, if not like highly internalized racism or externalized, depending on above or below the chart. They block social mobility based on race a lot. There's this bloodline fanaticism. They fear slander and new powers or young powers. They're completely prolific when they're working. They are unforgiving to perceived disloyalty. They resist force and forceful methods. Again, like when you read in these qualities, you have to determine if your Saturn is what quality it is. The kind of higher versions of Saturn will be from better placed Saturns, with good directional strength, with good aspectual testimony from planets in good signs with good aspects. And then, of course, sect. If Saturn is in a day chart, Saturn is going to function more beneficially or more structurally or more effectively. Saturn in a night chart tends to be kind of the lower, more brutal and more animalistic, primitive form of Saturn that is just not as interested in, it's just much more selfish. So Saturn in Aries is super prone to nervous disorders and bipolar disorder, and head issues, learning disabilities. This Saturn in Aries fights for prominence, and then the Libra Saturn earns prominence. So that's the difference, right? You can either you earn your reputation, or you can fight for it. And the Saturn in Aries spends their time fighting for it. Now we have the other two cardinals, because we're going by mode. The other two cardinals, which are also different, different winds, like east wind, south wind, north wind. So the Capricornian southern wind is the survival fear of the well-worn path, which is kind of, I guess, gives a Saturn in Capricorn a sort of regular and regulating, tactful, responsible function. And Saturn rules Capricorn, so Saturn is in domicile, has a steam there. It's certainly not weak at all. It just adds to the conventional, predictable version of Saturn and allows the manifestations to kind of take root a lot more effectively. Because Earth sign for Saturn is great. And in the Chinese system's, Saturn kind of was the Earth star. So oftentimes this person, though, has unachievable expectations for others, and they will impose their own values on those around them, which is super damaging socially. So your limitations are not the limitations of other people, and they do well to learn that if they ever learn that at all. They like material comforts, but they're not overly luxurious because they don't want to attract attention in a lot of ways. They tend to be low key. They like minimal conflict, low drama, cool, dry workspaces. They love protocol and rules and that sort of stuff. And they will impose boundaries, easily and quickly. They end up being appreciated for their actions and not who they are. But that's a big problem for them because they just want to be loved for who they are, but they're workaholics. And their public persona oftentimes outweighs their personal one. And that's true for Saturn in a lot of signs, especially the Earth signs. This Saturn in Capricorn could be prone to addiction issues to deal with that stress. So like you'll hear things like, how did you manage to run a company while addicted to heroin? Like, I don't know, I just did it. It's just a lot of control issues and a lot of depression, gloomy, discontented. They get success in the end, but sometimes will have a fall from grace because their success ends up being not enough to actually satisfy them. Go figure. So the exiled Saturn, or the detrimental Saturn, is when Saturn's in a sign opposite to one of Saturn's own signs. So that's Cancer and Leo. So Saturn will be in detriment in those signs. So not exile. Exile is more a term for debilitation. We'll get into that later. And the medical stuff too. So Saturn in Cancer has a survival fear of shifting foundations and insecurity. Kind of the most insecure because it's about perceived emotional instabilities, and speculation for the watered signs is like a natural protective mechanism. There's sort of a lawful ordering of parenting. This Cancer is kind of like the parenting, mothering, maternal sign. So Saturn there will kind of give this fear-based sheltering mechanism. It resists the unpleasant, so we'll kind of like sometimes keep to the superficial to avoid realizing the utter weight of their own insecurities. But they're usually zealous patriots, and they feel this duty to the homeland to protect their immediate environment, and they defend those home functions. Nelson Mandela, who is Saturn in Cancer, ended up just being imprisoned by the motherland. So like I said, it can go either way. It's just those themes will be there. There's going to be armoring and over-fortification. Saturn blocks the moon's rhythms, which can cause illnesses related to that, cyclical issues. There's emotional denial here, emotionally unconventional. It's not a great place for Saturn at all, especially since Saturn is an enemy of the moon, or the moon, rather, is an enemy of Saturn. So Saturn is super unhappy. There's an intense emotional security to paradigms of belief that are deemed safe and can make them pawns, emotional pawns. Despite thinking that they're in control, right? That's what makes them a pawn. Because of their control issues, you can be easily controlled. Try to grasp that if you can, use Saturn in water signs. They seek, belonging more than anything else. And they often will have fearful parents. And they'll be noble in partnerships. Yeah, for sure. Just there's like an overall intensity to Saturn in the water signs that isn't as much. Saturn's almost more intense in water than in fire. There's a sort of stabilization as this heavy Saturn moves through fire, but the heavy Saturn moving through water signs is like an anchor kind of scraping the bottom of a lake. It's like dredging up all this stuff, and then there's not really, Saturn lacks the ability to contextualize it in an effective way. So there's lots of psychological issues and trapping of psychological toxins, right? So we move on to the fixed mode. And so we have another 4 signs. that will move into, Leo, Aquarius, Taurus, and Scorpio. And there's one of each element, just as there was in the cardinal, and just as there will be in the mutable. But the fixed mode is the mode that concentrates and focuses energy. It symbolizes the principle of definition and structure that is started by the cardinal. So all the other signs start the project, and these signs kind of give a depth and meaning to that. For future use, right? It concentrates power. So it's concentrating rather than initiating. So these signs tend to offer stability, accumulation, and determination. And these signs, Saturn and these signs, they stick to their guns once they've made a decision, which gives them a really intense reputation for being stubborn. But they're consistent, and they're consistent, but their weakness is their inflexibility. So oftentimes their work requires context, like I was saying, and context provides the framework for progress. These people can be in free fall or decay and carry on as business as usual. So it's hard for them to get off a decaying track. But for them, in the end, work without meaning is dangerous. And these people eventually succumb to fatal futility, which I consider like Sisyphus syndrome. Sisyphus pushing that heavy rock up a hill. There's a story of that. If you don't know it, you can check it out. But generally, it's just like useless, the image of useless labor, the toil and the lessons in our life that we have to repeat over and over and over again. And certainly Saturn and fixed signs are going to repeat the same things of these Saturnian keywords. And we'll look at those for them now. So again, remember, Leo was in detriment, not exile, was in detriment in Cancer, but Leo is now going to be again in detriment. Saturn is now going to be in detriment in Leo. So the signs of the luminaries are bad. The northern luminaries are bad for Saturn. So Saturn here is an anti-exceptionalist, resists the urge of socially irresponsible creativity. There's a fear of this, or an intimidation of these, of uniqueness and imposed improvements or systems. So there's also a resistance to politics and pleasure. So there's very much a dictator quality to Saturn and Leo and the social environment they create. There's a rigid kind of dramatic expression, can make them hard to read, despite having really intense opinions. There's a stage fright that can happen to these people if they're in night charts. There's a cardiac stress for sure, and most Saturn and Leos will experience anxious hearts or heart flow issues. Stick around toward the end of the presentation for medical stuff. But Saturn and Leo is a personal genius by their own standards, and people can see that. They tend to punish that which is selfish and proud, and those around them and in themselves. Their authority is self-entitled, and they weaponize morality. That's really important. They justify their actions and can justify themselves ad infinitum, so they're blue in the face. Their principled laws sometimes are greater than their sense of truth, which oftentimes makes them a hypocrite. But they'll deny that. This is pretty inconsistent place for a fixed Saturn. Like, of all the fixed signs for Saturn to be in, Saturn is least able to function in a head down kind of way. Because there's a saying of one thing and then a doing of another. Because they crave attention, but there's a sense of denied admiration, no matter how much attention they get. But they bring a sense of responsibility to the realms of politics, games, children, and entertainment. There's a fear of appearing compromised, and appearances way more in some ways. So, if yeah, I guess setting boundaries is probably going to be the most important thing for Saturn and Leo, and the respect for the borders between people, because they can kind of get blurred by agenda. Aquarius and Saturn, though, is considered great, because Saturn rules Aquarius, and that's considered its mula trikona, or its like most powerful sign. So that would be considered a Jagrat Avasta, or completely awake, functioning really well. It regulates, Aquarius is networks, so Saturn regulates those networks. But there is that survival fear of mass assembly. So again, doesn't make a great politician, despite being a good campaign manager. It, imposes lawful systems on communities and ecologies. They tinker with communication and communication grids. They prefer narrow definitions as opposed to broad, sweeping generalizations, and they're pretty shrewd in that way. And they feel more comfortable with people that provide details. They like rank status, and they're serious and dry. They tend to have like X-ray vision, which makes them kind of hard to be around, because they can see the skeletal system or the intentions of people really easily. They are elegant with complex systems, and they come up with elaborate regulations. They can swing from idea to idea a little bit better than Saturn and Capricorn, but they retain their rigidity and hardened stance position. So they'll say one thing, and then if someone convinces them otherwise, they won't go. If you detail it correctly, they'll change their mind, but they'll start believing what you believe harder than you believe it, and they'll become like a zealot for your viewpoint. So it's like getting an Aquarius Saturn on your team is really great, but they blame that shiftiness on data, right, as opposed to their own opinions. They like to view themselves as being more fact-based, despite being incredibly opinionated people. Saturn says go slow. Saturn doesn't necessarily say no all the time, especially in Aquarius. Saturn is good at lateral thinking in this sign, but can freeze disorderly action, is completely thrown off by disorder. Aquarius Saturns use distractions in the form of stalling or delaying people, embargoes, and amputating resources for those around them as punishment. So they set up the system, and then as long as everyone's functioning correctly, if you're a dying limb on a branch, the Saturn Aquarius will prune you. So the other two are Taurus Saturn, which is kind of the survival fear of gathering herds, treasures, and accumulated resources. It's really good for farming in the agricultural side of Saturn, so a lot can be accomplished with Saturn and Taurus, and it's in the sign of Venus, which is a friend to Saturn. So Saturn will be more awake, more alert at the wheel. They struggle to achieve luxury, and there's a resistance to virtue and virility. So there's kind of there can be shame around Venusian pursuits of pleasure and a restriction around those pleasures, such as food, sex, or sensory anything. They like to resist the flimsy, superficial, unlawful luxuries, sensual luxuries, as being kind of taxing, or they'll put taxes on them. And they prefer simple pleasures, but that require endurance to maintain, right? Like an instrument that is made of a gourd is easy and cheap to make, but you constantly have to keep tuning it. There's a fear of modernity with the Saturn and Taurus. They kind of like more time-tested Earth. Earth-orientedness. These people collect histories and family lineages. They remember slights and damages. And they're not easily contented. And it's important to remember that for the Saturn and Taurus, that like not every pack needs an alpha. Scorpio Saturn, Saturn and Scorpio is in a place of an enemy. Saturn and Scorpio is really actually afraid of their own secrets and the secrets of others. They resist penetration and rupture in any way. And that can be physically, emotionally, psychologically, whatever, spiritually. There's unexpected forces that plague them frequently. Disasters are in their nightmares or in their subconscious. And their subconscious can be a disaster realm. Law and order is vain against sudden eruptions, cataclysm, and emergency responses. So Saturn and Scorpio suffers because none of the safety systems it puts in order are really of much use for the themes of the life force and the situations the native will get in. Because the lessons of this life are going to test their anxieties greatly, because their enemies and their lessons will be non-disclosed or hidden, like the hidden poisons and sabotage through impulse and the chemicals of the body. It prevents the advancement of sexual energy up the spine in tantric yogas. Saturn and Scorpio people have harder time with that. But nevertheless, the energy will explode upward, but it will be uncontrolled and misunderstood, that they will then have to re-bottle back down until they can re-stifle it into a place of trying to process that. So shame is the currency of Saturn and Scorpio. They can feel under attack by the virility of others. It kind of stonewalls your identity transformations and growth. But sometimes these people, death is kind of the only acknowledged gateway of the personality. So they can be frozen identities. They're good at ordering hostile environments, though, and they function well in high-pressure situations, that's for sure. But ultimately, they can become resentful of those conditions. And that's a super intense psychopoison for this Saturn and Scorpio. And there's, resistance is futile, and it's important to remember that. Their scarcity mindset has them gaining resources because they want to be ready for crisis. So they war ration things out. But even in times of peace, sometimes for the Saturn and Scorpio, it's hard to know times of peace. Lastly, we have the last four, the mutable modes, which are the Gemini, Virgo, Pisces, and Sagittarius, which are the signs ruled by Mercury and Jupiter. So the mutable mode is the one that distributes the energy that has been concentrated and focused by the fixed mode. So it's initiated by our cardinals, focused by the fixed, and now it's being distributed by the mutable. So the cardinal eats the food, the fixed digests it, and the mutable transports it through the body, through the bloodstream. So this mutable mode symbolizes the principle of flexibility and adaptation, and the new integration of the body, mind, and soul. So it's kind of like the alchemical axis. It symbolizes the principle of flexibility or adaptation, sorry. It attempts to make new, did I put that twice, really? Their purpose is to complete the work of the season and plan for the next season. They're receptive to change, and they kind of like a blend of the two other modes. So they're like cardinal plus fixed equals mutable. Their strength is diversity, and their weakness is instability and avoidance of conflict for the Saturn here. So one thing that's cool thing about Saturn here is like Saturn, her ability to work is her endurance to pain, or to painful things. And spiritual work is often painful, but if pain is perceived as productive or rehabilitative, we become immune to that pain. But in chronic, unchanging pain, sensitivity and adaptability to pain gets worse over time. There's lots of studies that show that, because pain becomes a thermometer of an anticipated end. Well, what does that mean exactly? Well, let's take an example in a real-world situation. So if you have someone who broke their back, they're going to go through rehabilitation and be able to endure pain because they think the pain is a form of getting better, or there's a progress of improvement over time, or a sense of improvement over time, which makes pain tolerable. But if you have someone with a chronic illness that is never going to get better, and there's just there's a sense of a lack of hope, actually the people the pain gets worse and worse and worse over time, the perception of that pain. Because to them, pain is the thermometer of progress. And when pain is the thermometer of your progress for Saturn and the mutable modes in Gemini, Virgo, Pisces, and Sag, your life is going to be filled with fear-based mechanisms. So this is great wisdom, and understand if you can, and don't if you can't. Gemini, Saturns are burdened by the mundane. So Mercury, a sign of Mercury. Lots of information coming at Saturn, which is a burden. Saturn struggles to use simple language for these complex ideas coming in, and struggles to communicate to those who are lesser in having that data, or don't have access to that data, or can't understand. So there's a superiority thing going on here. And almost, really in all of them, Saturn's kind of arrogant. But, in this position, Saturn would be very disciplined in commerce, collaboration, and communication, because Mercury. but it struggles to structure a perfectly clear message. They're sober in thought, and they tend to be terse in their delivery messages. They kind of cut the Gemini off into a more, that's actually probably nice for communication. Get to the point. Criticism and scrutiny from media, these people can be slandered a lot because they tend to be in the currency of media. There's a stiffness and coldness in hands and shoulders and arms, and Saturn can constrict the mental flow of Mercury. So it's like writer's block. These people are very prone to writer's block, or it may just be chronically blocked. There's a negativity bias, and that's true for all the Saturn and air signs. They tend to be much more negative, much more pessimistic. They either have extreme study loads or they have no educational quality at all. It's like extremes for these people. There's a rudimentary sexuality and a shallow concept of the complexity of others that makes them kind of bad lovers or unsophisticated. It improves with time, but they just have kind of a blaming and accusatory sense where they will blame the other before the self and kind of in their own internalized scripts and in unchatty ways. They can be pretty externally oriented, and they may not even know how depressed they are. So they require strict mental routine to avoid depression and blowout, because the depression comes from exhaustion if your Saturn is in Gemini, and it requires meditation really to produce anything of depth, because you're just not as comfortable going into the deeper realms, because that's not where your social capital lies, or your mental cognitive processing, how it works. But you do have a sober mind, and it is powerful. Nonetheless, you just have more mental afflictions to deal with, and mental afflictions kind of affects one's sense of virtue. So you have to kind of avoid underhanded methods and underhanded dealings as well. Saturn and Gemini can make a theft of ideas. Saturn and Sagittarius Saturn, though, is the opposite of that. These are all opposites. Survival fear of sanctuary. The old order resists new teachings. The systems imposed upon theories and places of learning or religious institutions. Saturn here is the guiding principle. It's kind of pedantic and teaching, ritualistic, orthodox, but is somehow limited in its access to the highest, truest philosophical understanding. So the highest mountaintops are unavailable, despite being circling the mountain over and over and over again like a religious zealot. There's a lot of philosophical hierarchies here, or there can be like a displaced priesthood. They will have to go off on their own and travel. Their travels will be their guru, their teacher, because of a severed lineage or a refugee kind of status. They're hopelessly disoriented in this way, because they are blocked, that mountaintop view. It's hard for them to get a broader worldview without travel or without leaving the place where they are. So travel is actually really good for them. Gain in securities, investments in young companies, traveling, pilgrimage, these are all great. They can pretty much predict the future through insight and self-study. And self-study helps them become masters of like the human condition. They're slow to integrate opposing internal complexities of the God, man, animal of the axis, right? We are both divine and beast, and Saturn is slow to sort of work with those energies. Virgo Saturn and Pisces Saturn. Well, Virgo Saturn is interesting. It's kind of like the fixed criticism and the fixed the places where we need to litigate and go to court, and it's the karmas of our life work. It's definitely a house that is filled with obligations to disease or victimization, often divorce and betrayal, exploitation and servitude. They make really great officers and health scientists, social workers, or public servants, and they can be notorious in this. There's a negativity bias because of that. There's also that mercurial, thinking oneself into a ditch or digging one's own grave mentally. They often think about improvements, right? They're solution oriented, So they say, but what they are is that creates a sense of pessimism. How could this be better? But always. They're good in social policy, and that's great. But sometimes they try to fix things that aren't broken. And this can create social conflict. So if they're self-serving, they're gonna for sure get depressed. Saturn and Virgo isn't gonna be happy just being self-served. Motivation can be limited if left to their own devices. But somehow the public always wants more from them, so be prepared for that. They tend to be accusatory. That's a second nature for them. They're gonna have to grow out of that. They can exploit those in lower power situations. So if the perfection doesn't debilitate them, they can get a lot of work done. It's important for them to criticize methods and techniques, but don't criticize people. They structurally fear the failure of their own logic, so they will review things over and over and over again. Pisces and Saturn is, ruled by, Pisces is ruled by Jupiter, so there's that neutral relationship Saturn has. So it really depends on Jupiter a lot, how it's going to function. But there's a survival fear of imprisonment here, or a fear of deep dreams, sleep, and just loss in general. There's a disciplined imagination, and the imagination can be a work realm. Play is work. It imposes order on the psychoetheric perception. There's this interdimensional experience, and there's a connection, or a severed connection sometimes, to the ancestral genetic lineage. So, there's a slowed recognition of spiritual signals, or signals delivered by guides. So there can be, your guide might be shooting a flare in your face, and you won't be able to see it. Because Saturn can kind of oppose the psychic facilities here, if poorly aspected. We looked at Jupiter and other things. Usually there's concentration issues, and like the childhood had to be aborted, or the emotional development is completely stunted, or stunted in a specific way. They are bound to the belief that they are destined to be mystics or artistic, but they actually struggle to achieve the inner peace that they need to achieve that artwork. And that's because the quality of their aloneness is important. These people should create a lymph-like, womb-like sense of privacy. They need nests. With these people, there's a self-imposed lack or delay of creative opportunity, and they tend to remain arrogant and unheeding to the most basic of remedies. They're reserved, though, and secretive. They're calm, quiet, and generally optimistic, much more optimistic than a Saturn Virgo, but rooted in circular, sometimes self-destructive pragmatism. Working with children, psychology, water is good for kind of dissolving their salty personalities. Once these, it can get them out of creative ruts. But, like I said, there's a lot of room for accumulation of mental poison, and that's true for Saturn and all the water signs in all the modes, cardinal, fixed, or immutable. Quickly, we're just going to talk about the overview of Saturn through the houses. Saturn is, in the first, is resistance to impulse, but obligation to the regular, and regularity, or routine. Saturn in second is resistant to historical values, but is totally invested in resource conservation. Saturn in third house is resistance to collaborating and collaboration and network, but is obliged to message or discuss or to disseminate. Saturn in fourth is resistant to parents, but is obliged to culture. Saturn in the fifth is resistant to individualism, but can cause regulation of creativity, or the lawful order of offspring or products. Saturn in sixth is resistance to accusations, medicine, but is obliged to litigate or is obliged to play the victim. Saturn in seventh is resistant to yoga or centralization or unification, but in the end is obliged to form alliance. Saturn in 8 is resistant to hidden forces or death itself, but is obliged to keep the secrets or theirs or others. Saturn in 9th is resistant to doctrine or being indoctrinated, but is obliged to preach and teach and maintain doctrines nevertheless. Saturn in 10th is resistance to leadership roles, but somehow is obliged to be an icon sitting on a throne. Saturn in 11 is resistant to friendly association, but obliged to regulate earnings or oversee systems of social capital. Saturn in 12 is resistance to retreat, but is obliged to take sanctuary and ancestor wisdom. So that's kind of interesting to me. If we look at them in more detail, you can see that Saturn in the first house, or the ascending Saturn, is their whole life is acting under pressure, under the weight of Saturn. The whole life force is being sat on by the elephant of Saturn. They move, but they move slowly. It affects the physical body and the physical appearance a lot more. So do all the angles, which are the first house, fourth house, seventh house, 10th house. Those will affect the appearance a lot more of giving a Saturn look, which is kind of dark complected, skinny, bony, dry, sharp-nosed, thick-eyed, just dark complexion with kind of sharp bones, prominent bones. They are, or Saturn in first is kind of like gives you this fixed identity, for better or worse. And you can kind of pause these and look at these in more detail. Saturn in second is all about karma of family, food, finance, and language. And its social duty limits or slows the size of the family treasury. These people tend to be either a learned villain or a wise counsel, but there's a denial of self-worth, a fear of polluting the group, and definitely still gives strong facial features of Saturn because it's so close to the ascendant. Definitely a banker. This is like the banker position for Saturn, the dusting off of all your beebles and baubles you've collected, right? The second house is like, just has to do with treasure in general, or what you treasure. So Saturn in third is kind of resistant to messages and communication. There's a fear of collaboration, as we talked about earlier, but there's this profound sense of responsibility to communicate and to publish and to write. There's this deep internalized fear of dismissal or excommunication from the group or the neighborhood or the thought group. So they're especially prone to social manipulation because they tend to be isolated in childhood and definitely pretty much ostracization or alienation is pretty common for them. And they learn to function, their resolve is often tested by this, the depression of being misunderstood. So Saturn in fourth is also it's very much about emotional anxiety, social emotional anxiety, but more from a home perspective or the home base, and alienation from the parents rather than the neighborhood at large. So Saturn in the fourth can also resist socializing education and kind of give an individualization that comes from resistance to a no-based identity. That meets, there's kind of like a rulership or like a dominion over, gatekeeping of social licensing. And basically, if they don't follow the rules of the homeland or where they are, then they'll get frozen access to their cultural roots or shelters and vehicles and farmlands. So there's definitely a great fear of homelessness and being on the wrong foot. Oftentimes their work goes unseen, but they're dutiful and hardworking nonetheless. There's definitely no trophies needed for these people. It kind of delays movement or impedes movement, and these persons can be nostalgic feelings can be very painful for them. Saturn in fifth is like conventional creativity. They need attention to be healthy, but they're not permitted to be special or unique, which hurts them. There's a rigid structure to their self-expression, and they're very performative in some ways. But there's definitely a disciplined practice of their artwork and their craft. So they are crafts people. create beautiful, beautiful things at high levels. They kind of resist amusement and celebrity. They consider sometimes these things to be detractful or distracting. They can be sexual anxieties and sexual performance issues based on fear of self-worth. Their job will end up being spend a lot of time herding cats, and they'll kind of like high maintenance creative types, despite themselves not being as high maintenance. They love the perfection of the performance, though. They try to resist egocentricity, and they can produce really great meditators. But nevertheless, they'll be always surrounded. They'll be always surrounded by sensual pleasures. So they have to find that balance of like denying pleasure, and that's always going to be an access to them, like swing the dryness of celibacy. If you lose it if you don't use it, honey. Saturn in sixth causes chronic illnesses and chronic problems and chronic enmity, but also like makes them like really good apprentices, and the apprentices in the classroom of life. So it's a good spiritual position. So it's kind of like this ongoing ordeal of old accusations and enduring imbalances. There's like this perpetual pursuit of resolution, and resolution is just a state of extremes. So there's got to be a way for there to be balance in all walks of life. They need to withdraw from the critical mind. They see problems and not pleasures. So there's this karma for these Saturn and six to have enemies, debts, pollution, conflict. And the one that you enslave owns you in all actuality. So the things that you try to control and order end up ordering you. Their scarcity mindset obliges them to argue, defend, explain, litigate, accuse, and crusade against others. They work or themselves. They work on behalf of the exploited, however, and they can be, diligent in protecting or shedding light on the criminal realms, toxic, polluted earth, the margins, or the untouchable people, and can give assistance in those realms. They don't waste their energy because there's usually very little of it, or precious, or perceived little of it. Think of the medical term hypo, or a lack of nutrients, lack of oxygen, generally there's just an underproduction of the things that they need, or the resources they need, and they attend constantly to broken things. They tend to be more loyal to their own soul, though, despite lack of trust and support among other humans. And that Saturn in 7 is all about contracts, marriages, alliance, bargains, and trades. It's just all about the fine print. Saturn 7th is all about relationships and enduring loyalty in relationships. It's got heavy responsibility of unchanging conditions. These people tend to be pillars of societies because 1st, 4th, 7th, and 10th houses are angles. But this pillar of society is eroded by time. They're steady, reliable partners, but they like predictable environments. They make stubborn sacrifices, and they have hard-to-please parents. And, unfortunately, a lot of the things that they do come to light in the public affairs. They sustain their effort despite limited resources. These are very much like yes people, despite Saturn being so no. They can also be, if poorly aspected, this can be, they can give like a lack of attachments, or a cold attachment style, which can make them very lonely, or give them partnerships that are more transactional or older, where there's maybe not as strong as emotional affinity as a security-based thing. So there's definitely, the first marriages can be unequal. There can, if there's not enough growth in the love life, there can be, that can threaten the contracts that Saturn in 7 loves so dearly. Ceaseless bargaining can alienate people. There's things you can negotiate on, and there's things that you can't, and Saturn in 7th needs to learn that. Not everything is negotiable, and you can actually insult people's integrity, because only dead things don't change, and contracts should be living to accommodate the changes in others. um, projected changes. So they can be inflexible. A sober lover, though, they prefer sober situations. Saturn in eighth must keep secrets. They're obliged to. The eighth house is kind of like the fear of the conditions of death, but in the end, the price of stability is change, and Saturn here will spend their life learning that. The resistance to change actually gives them a long life because of this fear of death, the curse of which is that they will be separated from the beloved and their alliances, and then be more surrounded by the undesired. That is the curse of an old age. They will have to deal with the wicked. Heavy duty from the family they marry into, heavy duties towards the in-laws. This causes seizure of the reproductive organs, delayed sexual maturity or experiences. There's a fear or a gravitas of the mate's treasuries or family wealth, or a lack thereof. Resistance to resilience to danger, or resistance and resilience to dangerous situations. They're survivors. There's a resistance to ego death, though, that causes longevity through fearful attachment. This kind of Saturn in eighth is like emergency laws, martial law, invasions, crisis intervention, unexpected government intervention. But psychologically, they tend to be past-oriented or intimidated by financial changes. PTSD causes repetition of catastrophe. They count their scars more than their blessings. They're tested by hidden adversaries, and they expect. They not only expect the negative, they are sort of comforted by the negative. Saturn ninth is like this is pretty much your religion, the house of God. So Saturn there is going to give tedious piety, old beliefs, rigid patronage, cautious fathers, kind of fossilizes your creativity and causes fear-based beliefs. This person collects father figures or teachers, spiritual teachers, but can limit access to collaborators, friends, and physicians. Generally, these people, though, are intimidated by threats to their philosophy, and if they learn how to debate and they learn to be open and they learn to yield to or try to incorporate other ideas and be more incorporating rather than divisional, these people can benefit from that. They have their idols are material. They need they need to worship in a physical way. They receive and they make hallow. They sanctify the rules in an institution or in a religion. And they certainly will treat institutions like a religion. They believe in the transformative power of work, and they end up finding lots of work in foreign lands. Saturn in 10 is called the throne yoga in Jyotish. It's kind of like old money, old hierarchy. This is just like Saturn at the lever, the wheel, it's like lawful leadership. But Saturn leads from behind. There's like this fear of public exposure or fear of the public because of such a rigid idea of the public persona that doesn't want to be threatened. There's a fear of the father's family. This person is the proverbial boss, master, elitist, follows the rules. Has to follow the rules or they lose access to dignity, privilege, and reputation. They shirk public leadership, yet they end up having to govern because they're the only ones fit, or people insist, or they're the only ones capable. It gives danger to siblings, or danger from siblings. Slander is always in the shadowy blind spot of Saturn in 10th. They like jobs that consistently grow. They don't like quick ascension in career. They like to build from the ground up. Favor the underdog. They notice that which goes unseen. They prefer to choose how a social pyramid is ordered, and that impels them into the realm of philanthropy. They tend to be rude, crude, and blunt, but that's because they understand and are motivated by a painful understanding of the collective stunted growth. Saturn in 11th is networks, the house of networks, social capital, colleagues. So Saturn here must maintain the commonwealth of old economies and networks. It's intimidated by difficult economic or social decisions. There is a fear of gainfulness and venture. There's this terror of the uprising of the commoner, the masses, and public gathering. They're very skeptical. They can be skeptical of friends. So trust is a practice in trusting the network is important. It's good for wealth and longevity, but not necessarily health. And because it depends, this person's health will depend on access to communities of care. Illness can cause isolation from society, and there's a great effort to maintain network. They have to follow the rules. They experience frozen networks, or if people don't follow the rules, they punish people by freezing access to the group. They disassociate in loneliness. They rebuild and repair economies of social capital over long periods of time, but in a regular, controlled way. Later in life, they usually have many connections, and they like to build people up. Saturn in 12th is a hard house for Saturn, but Saturn is nevertheless considered to joy here in the house of the bad spirit, or the bad daemon, because Saturn here can fulfill a lot of karmic duties. And it's not necessarily a happy placement, but it is a powerful one nonetheless for Saturn to be in the 12th house. The karmic sense and the karmic development can limit Saturn's access here to peaceful sanctuary, dream understanding, and spiritual guidance. Saturn here is intimidated by difficult spiritual courses that may differ from the path imposed by ancestral karma and trauma. This is a very traumatized Saturn in the subconscious, in the collective. Saturn here has painful insight into history, which gives them very powerful predictive capacity. Especially Saturn 12th water sign. They follow the treasuries and animals and herds and governs them in a lawful way. They are often obliged to retreat or disappear, or to, some form of protection will end up being needed. They're very restless in enclosures or lawfully imposed sanctuaries, which is imprisonment. They are both the prosecutor and the prosecuted with government setbacks. They have identity loss issues from like certain events, and they can get PTSD from that. The ghosts surrounding them and floating around them are the unacceptance of what can't be seen. So there's, they have like these hidden anxieties over controlling their own actions, so their own psychological pain, and oftentimes 12 is all about your sleep. So Saturn there can cause insomnia or sleep deprivation or lack of privacy or a delay in gaining access to family lineage identity. So there's definitely a lot of identity work. This person's Saturn in 12th is very busy within themselves because of the karma of distant lands, imprisonment, and just disappearance in general. The things that are coming about quickly disappear. Attachment, detachment. It's yoga or die, basically, for you. So we're moving on to the last parts of this presentation, and this is medical Saturn. And I want to just talk about wind, and medical Saturn as the chief of the nervous wind. So in Ayurveda, you have 15 wild beasts. 5 of them are here. They're called Prana, Udana, Dhyana, Samana, and Apana. So Prana is basically, well, let's just start with Saturn's. The chief of all of the winds, the sort of queen of the winds is Apana, which is the downward wind. You can see this arrow here. This is kind of like the pressurizing wind, the suctioning wind that kind of regulates all the others. It's your excretory release valve. So the system can only be as healthy as the release valve or the pressure valve. And that makes a lot of sense in any mechanistic system, in any engine. Because of that, Saturn rules excretory, or excretion, or the wastes of the body. And that's the throne of Saturn. And any sort of medical tradition that's dealing with, stabilizing digestion, we want to push the vitiated or disturbed elements down towards the central channels of the body and out through Apana Vayu. And your urination, your ejaculations, your pooping, all of that is considered a downward wind. So Apana Vayu is definitely has to do with ancestral lineages and generations of people because of that association with ejaculation and the outward, downward movement of life force. The bathtub drain, right? It's how you get rid of these toxic winds. And as such, any Saturn condition can be improved by pushing the winds or, opposing the qualities of Saturn, which we'll go over in detail, and then evacuating them down and out. This is one of the principles of Panchakarma in Ayurveda. Specifically, massage is really great, or internal medicines that facilitate this process. But the enemy of Saturn is constipated channels, and the colon, because it's the throne, is the most important. If you get constipated, or your blood or your venous return, your arteries become blocked, or any barrier becomes blocked, you're going to create a wind problem, which creates a communication problem which between cells, which causes nervous electrical system problems, which causes lymphatic issues, which disturbs the blood, which disturbs, it's just, and that's just one chain reaction. That's just one version. It's just a chain reaction of disease. And more like 60% of diseases in Ayurveda are caused by the nervous wind, which is ruled by Saturn. That's why Saturn's the chief malefic, and even one of the greatest malefics. And here's medical Saturn's effect on Jack Nicholson in The Shining, where, Saturn, I thought it's great because Saturn was considered like he's a decapitator of children as Kronos, because he eats his own children so they don't usurp him in power. And certainly Jack Nicholson was like Saturn, like Kronos here, because he loses his mind and he chases his son through a snowy labyrinth. He gets lost and freezes to death. So Saturn cryogenically freezes whatever body part is represented by his zodiac sign of natal resonance. So if Aries rules the head, Saturn in Aries is going to restrict, constrict, freeze, dry out the head, the brain, the upper facial muscles. So his movement, the orb you want to use is 1 degree for natal and medical, for medical stuff. Because his movement is so slow, you want to use that tight orb, and you'll kind of see where his most devastating effects are going to be natally or medically, especially his retrograde exact conjunction. So through transit, his retrograde conjunction is particularly cold. Saturn rules Capricorn and Aquarius. We already talked about those. But the minerals he rules is calcium. His metal is lead. The vitamins to boost, tonify, or improve Saturn are vitamin C, folic acid, and vitamin P. Saturn rules substance P, which is a pain neurotransmitter, and that's what massaging people, and that reduces substance P within the nerves and blood, which reduces pain. It's this mysterious transmitter from this that works on the CNS, that works on the central nervous system, and how it links to the peripheral nervous system. So substance P, which is P is also the letter of P, the syllables of Saturn. Saturn's ray is violet. Its gemstone is sapphire. You want to use extreme caution using gemstones, like especially well-cut, whole, high-carat sapphire. Saturn governs the bones, ligaments, tendons, cuticles, nails, teeth, hair, all the mineralized sort of structural parts of the body, as well as the acid-containing parts of the body, like the gallbladder. The right ear is ruled by Saturn. Gallstones in the gallbladder have a high content of lead, and that's Saturn's metal. So there's a correlation there. Saturn's action is astringent. It refrigerates, it tightens, it congeals, it mineralizes, it atrophies, it dries. It's a hemostatic, it's a fever, so it's good for fevers. It establishes boundaries, so it's a febrifuge. Saturn's conditions are basically this dinosaur egg, and it has to hatch under sustained idiotic conditions. So basically, if your Saturn is asleep, you're more likely to achieve, remember, go back to the Zavastas. If you have an afflicted Saturn, either by sign position or aspect, you can see if Saturn is asleep at the wheel, and figure out if you're going to be able to make the adjustments necessary to avoid the sort of permanent detrimental changes that are so common for these placements. My brain just completely shut off. Okay, so Saturn restricts the zodiac sign, like we said, that he's in or she's in, but he restricts the square and the opposition, the hard aspects as well. So any planet in his backwards sextile will receive a particularly harsh dryness, and that planet is going to feel, basically isolates that planet and makes that planet very Saturnian and it can really depress the functioning and dry out that planet. So the backwards sextile of Venus, for example, is pretty intense emotionally. Highly responsive to acupuncture, though, because wind is touch, and touch is our skin and nervous system. So especially with good Mercury testimony, acupuncture can be incredibly good for regulating those winds I was talking about in that first slide. Psychologically, if Saturn's below the horizon, you're going to be much more internalizing, and you're going to internalize everything in your life, which creates a lot of psychological work. You will need a therapist. Actually, everyone needs a therapist. Psychologically, will be much more accusatory if above the horizon. And that displaced responsibility or the resentment of the outer conditions will also be a psychological stunting. Saturn rules wasting conditions because the wind of Saturn, the cold wind of Saturn, blows out the digestive catalytic fires of the body, and it causes the fires in the body to try to overcompensate. I like to use the analogy of, if I turn the burners on, the gas on the burners up really high, and then I blow the fire out, the gas just leaks out, and you end up exhausting your supply of gas and creating other problems, of course, like you can poison yourself or whatever. It's this toxic state of wasting. And wasting is a toxic state because your muscles are deteriorating, and that basically, it's like that's the symbol of HIV, AIDS, cancer, or any sort of nefarious, insidious condition. It's the fires of the body get blown out, and then you actually can't restart them because the wind is too high. And certainly with Saturn, once the winds are too high or too out of balance, after a certain time, it becomes kind of impossible to regulate it at all. And that's what causes the end stages of AIDS. Excess Saturn over mineralizes. So you can see bone spurs or odd bone repair after breaking. It'll repair quickly, but in an ugly way. Same thing with scars. It will scar over quickly, but in an ugly way. So in excess, you also see paralysis, hyper anxiety, moles, and warts. Deficiency of Saturn, or a poor placement of Saturn, is poor connective structuring. Boundary setting in cells is low. Communication between cells can be low. Low minerals, deafness, absorption issues, hypoxia, basically hypo issues, and hypothyroidism even, in the right signs, and anemia. So medical Saturn and a fire, you can, again, pause these and look at them because I'm kind of blast through them. But generally, Saturn is a lot warmer here, and especially in a day chart above the horizon, you're going to avoid the coldest issues. But it's going to inhibit that catalytic process and going to make that, like I was saying, that Dragon-Yang syndrome be a lot worse. So the digestion of food and sensory information can be delayed. There's latent blood issues here. It hides the alarm systems of the body. It freezes the neuromuscular junction. It causes hemoglobin and anemia because of the oxygen being improperly distributed. It causes surgical nightmares because of anesthesia-induced hypofunction, blood pressure, and there's actually expedited healing here, but without watching that, the healing process can cause its own problems and cause its own structural deformities. Saturn and Earth signs gives a fracturing dry strength, super strength, in fact, if in a night chart below the horizon. It's like a guitar string. You can pull it really tight and causes beautiful resonance of strength, but eventually it snaps. So Saturn and Earth signs causes substitute prosthetic limbs or bones, toxic accumulation in the bones, causing heat. So even though Saturn's cold, it can cause hot conditions. Saturn and Earth signs, it can cause heavy metal poisoning and demineralization. It kind of slows the acidic excretions of the acidic containers and causes hard ingrained habits to break. And these are motivated by pain or chronic pain endurance. Saturn and air signs tend to be more anxious, restless, negative, and that's because of internal or external cold friction. Saturn is air, so you're going to get a lot more air on air equals more air. So vata issues. So you look back to those channels of the wind, you're going to have a lot of issues for those because you're sensitized pain channels. That's substance P production. It freezes joints and movement, slows inadequate distribution of nutrients, slows communication and speech. Saturn just kind of, it's too much air for Saturn. Cold extremities, Raynaud syndrome, weak ligaments, and going back, fire and a Saturn fire causes inflamed or weak or structurally weird tendons, which is muscle to bone, and then air signs causes weird ligament issues, which is bone to bone. Right? Get it? But overall, Saturn has dominion over both, and one can affect the other. The skin will be the alarm system for the Saturn and air. But Saturn and water is possibly the worst elemental placement because of the toxic element of Saturn's waste. It putrefies the waters of the body, it dries them out, and then putrefies them, one or the other, or swells through blocking of channels. It's like a dam. It dams up the lymph system, and especially in a night birth with Saturn below the horizon, it can cause a lot of pooling or swamp-like effects. There's a lot of cellular waste that can be troublesome. So exercise and movement and pungent heating things and heating, clarifying, tonifying herbs that purify the blood can dry out the skin, digestive fluids, causing malabsorption. It can be the heaviest depression of all. But I don't know. Saturn and Earth signs can be just as depressed. I think they just whine about it less, or they don't try to infect other people with their depression as much as Saturn and water signs. Like Saturn and water sign people, their energy just sort of completely dominates a room. Here's that was a negative note, but ultimately all these things can be mitigated by aspect and awareness. Like I said, you have to see what you're working with and then try to help Saturn as much as possible, because Saturn in the chart makes concrete the effects of the other planets, right? So if you tonify and petition Saturn in that way, you might see that all the other planets in your chart also start to improve, because your reality will change, not just your fantasy. Even though fantasy can be precipitated, or reality can be precipitated by changes in fantasy. And so some of my references here: Michael Myers' Handbook for the Humanist Astrologer, those initials, the modes, information on the modes. Almost 70% of the descriptions of stuff was taken from Barbara Pijan, or for astrological data on barbarapijan.com, she's a Jyotishi and like Tibetan astrologer. A lot of good, interesting work there. But she uses the names of the Sanskrit Indian names, or for the planets. If you don't know them, her website will be confusing. Of course, a lot of this is also based on the Brihat Parashara Horishastra. That's where she gets her information, and I check some things, which is good to check out as well. It's like the textbook of Indian basics. Judith Hill's Medical Astrology in Action, The Transits of Health, was a large chunk of that medical stuff with my little blurbs added in. And then Ernst Wilhelm's Graha Sutras, which is a lot about Saturn's nature that I've woven into this. I hope you enjoyed this presentation, and that you have kind of a better concept of how Saturn works in your life, what things you need to be looking out for, and others. Definitely go back and pause things and review. I'll try to make the PDF available probably within this month. Be looking for new videos on the decans and different divisional charts, which I'm going to start to teach the sort of easier ones that are less intimidating. So being spoon-fed, right, the basics of Indian astrology. I'm also going to do the avastas, eventually. Who knows when? I don't think there's going to be other planets that I'm going to do for a long time. I'm not going to walk through all of them because that's just some basic research, and I want to kind of move into intermediate advanced stuff. But nevertheless, check out my general work on mythology of the planets, and check out a Queer Astrology Club. Go to astrovedicus.wordpress.com. You can donate or read my writings if you want to see me improve and grow and be able to support myself while I try to support the psychic development of the entire community surrounding me. So, yeah, have a good Saturday. Saturn.